I think we have done very well. And it is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Mr. John Allen. John Allen, Jr. is, according to the London Tablet, the most authoritative Vatican writer in the English language. Since 1999, he has served as the prize-winning Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter and a CNN analyst on Vatican affairs. He also appears on National Public Radio. His reporting is admired across ideological divides. Liberal commentator Andrew Greeley calls Allen's Vatican analysis indispensable, while conservative Richard John Newhouse says possibly the best reporting on the Holy See published in the United States is Allen's weekly The Word from Rome internet column. Writing in Newsweek magazine in 2003, veteran religion writer Kenneth Woodward described Allen as the journalist other reporters, and not a few cardinals, look to for the inside story on how all the Pope's men directs the largest world's church. John Allen is the author of 3 books on Vatican affairs: Conclave, The Politics, Personalities, and Process of the Next Papal Election; All the Pope's Men, The Inside Story of How the Vatican Really Thinks; and The Rise of Benedict XVI, The Inside Story of How the Pope was Elected and Where He Will Take the Catholic Church. His most recent work is Opus Dei, an objective look behind the myths and reality of the most controversial force in the Catholic Church. All are published by Doubleday, and those books will be sold outside. John Allen is a graduate of the University of Kansas with a master's degree in religious studies, and he and his wife have just moved to New York City, but they also share a home in Rome as well. I have asked John to speak to us this morning on the gift of consecrated life to the church in the world, and where does he see this lining up with the Holy Father's call for renewal of consecrated life within our church. So, John, it's my privilege to welcome you.
Good morning. Now, I can't help but note, as I mount the podium this morning, that you all have placed here this. Now, as a note to conference organizers, this is not exactly the best way to put your keynote speaker at ease. Paul, thank you for that introduction, although I need to correct you on one point. I am actually not CNN's Vatican analyst. I am CNN's senior Vatican analyst. Which just sounds tremendously impressive until you realize we only have one. But it's a delight to be here this morning. I want to begin this morning with a reference to G.K. Chesterton, that incomparable Catholic genius of the early 20th century, who was also, it needs to be said, one of his era's most notorious curmudgeons. Chesterton once observed that, in his opinion, it was unnecessary for the Bible to counsel us both to love our enemies and also to love our neighbors, because, he said, in his experience, these are usually the same people. Not sure any of us would have wanted to live across the hall from G.K. Chesterton. My own favorite bit of his wit and wisdom is that he once said that the Catholic Church is like a good steak, a bottle of red wine, and a good cigar. Now, in his era, I suppose the point would have been obvious. Today, in our culture of lean cuisine and anti-smoking hysteria, I suppose I need to say that was intended as a compliment. And by the way, while we're on the subject of gastrointestinal ecclesiology, let me observe that were I not here with you this morning, I would be on the Holy Father's trip to Bavaria. This is actually the first papal trip in 7 years that I've missed. And I did so, of course, because I'd already accepted your gracious invitation. And I don't know if you understand the full implications of what that means. But what it means is that in order to stand with you this morning, I have given up an opportunity to sample the world's best sausage and beer. Sisters and brothers, you will never need additional evidence of the full measure of my devotion to your cause. Now, back to G.K. Chesterton. He opened his classic work, Orthodoxy, by observing that it is a fashion among modern scientists to pretend that it never occurred to anyone prior to Isaac Newton to begin their theories with observable facts. In reality, Chesterton said, Christianity has always proceeded in precisely this fashion. The Christian theory about the meaning of human existence, about the significance of Christ and the mission of the church, began with a fact that he called as plain as potatoes, to wit, the fact of sin. And well, in that Chestertonian spirit, I would like to begin our reflections this morning with another fact, one just as obvious and one, quite frankly, equally depressing. It's a reality painfully well known to those of you in this room who bear responsibility for vocations within the religious communities you serve. And this fact is, of course, the steep decline in religious life, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. Expressed in quantitative terms, we are living through one of the most pronounced bust cycles for religious life in its history. And a few drearily familiar statistics make the point. From its peak in 1968, the number of religious women in this country has dropped from 204,000 to 67,000, a dizzying decline by any measure. Just as alarming, according to the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, the average age of American religious women today is 69 and rising. And numbers from men's communities are, of course, comparably discouraging. To take just one example, many of you will be aware that the Jesuits in the United States are currently involved in a process of strategic discernment, studying the future of their ministries. One premise of that study is that the current number of roughly 2,600 Jesuit priests in the United States could be cut in half by the middle of the century. And similar projections on a different scale could and, of course, have been drawn up for most men's communities in the country. But obviously, you don't need me to catalog this litany of woe, because it is the stuff of your daily experience. Those of you in this room, I hazard to guess, are being pulled in far more directions than the typical religious woman or man of a generation ago, in order, in part, to pick up the slack in your communities that lack the personnel to cover all their commitments. And apropos of this reality, I'd like to take the opportunity this morning to deliver a message to you. Now, I have no warrant to speak on behalf of anyone, but I nevertheless dare to give you this message, a simple two-word message, which is thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for the heart with which you do it. Your fidelity offers a precious witness that religious life, what the Holy See in its recent document Starting Afresh from Christ called this chosen host among the sons and daughters of the church, still has a future. Indeed, without you, we could not be the church. I can imagine a Catholic Church without its bureaucrats. I can imagine a Catholic Church without its impressive change of social institutions. I can even, God help us all, imagine a Catholic Church without its Vatican correspondence. But a Catholic Church without women and men religious is quite simply unthinkable. Both individually and as communities, you show us that the values of the kingdom are tangible flesh and blood possibilities, but still have the power to shape lives if we but have the courage to say yes. And so if you hear nothing else from me today, please hear this, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you. By the way, those of you that are called upon to do public speaking from time to time, I really recommend this to you as a rhetorical strategy. Always start by flattering your audience. After that, you can get away with murder. Now, the integrity of your witness does not dispense us from the necessity of making sense of the signs of the times. So what answer are we to give to the fact as plain as potatoes of the numerical crisis of religious life? It is perhaps easier to identify the wrong answer than to lay our hands on the correct one. The wrong answer, I would submit, is succumbing to a quantitative mentality whereby any model that seems to offer some promise of stemming the bleeding is to be embraced. So, some zealous young people seem to respond to habits and to veils. Fine, dust them off, put them back on, as long as they sign up. Other candidates seek a postmodern form of religious life where we make only temporary commitments and we adjust our traditional spiritual disciplines to suit their tastes. Again, fine, as long as there are a few new parts to keep the machinery running. Now, without passing judgment on any of these ideas, I would suggest that a willy-nilly metamorphosis driven by the numerical bottom line is a prescription for losing our way. And of course, you don't have to take this on my authority. Sister Joan Chittister recently said that focusing on the numbers in analyzing religious life amounts to giving a capitalist answer to a Christian question. While Pope Benedict XVI, in his meeting with religious superiors in Rome on the 22nd of May, issued a similar warning about the danger of seeing consecrated life within what he called the framework of worldly logic. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit that when Joan Chittister and Joseph Ratzinger are in perfect harmony on a question, I guess I don't need to finish that sentence. We have come across a truth that lies beyond ideological spin and competing theological agendas. Now, for you, I believe, this ought to be a liberating insight, because what it implies is that your primary concern in a time of declining membership should not be reversing those declines, at least not directly. Of course, growth is a sign of vitality, and it's a consummation devoutly to be wished. Yet what drives you in the first place ought to be how to express the traditional genius of religious life in today's context. Seeking growth for its own sake puts the cart before the horse. But when people become aflame with purpose, inspired by an ideal for which they are willing to live and to die, the strength of that conviction generates a kind of gravitational pull which inevitably draws others into its orbit. The key to recovery, therefore, is not primarily new vocations, but a renewed sense of purpose. Now, to state the obvious, I am not a religious, and what I'm about to say, therefore, falls under the aegis of an outsider's perspective. You take it for what it's worth. Neither am I a theologian, and I am certainly no expert in the spiritual life. In fact, I think the state of my own soul could probably be best summed up in an anecdote about Evelyn Waugh, another famous 20th century Catholic writer. Waugh was, of course, notoriously ill-mannered and crude and so on, and one evening, as he was giving a lecture, he was in particularly poor form. And an elderly lady came up to him afterwards and said, "I don't understand how you can call yourself a Christian and do the things that you do." To which Waugh responded, "Madam, everything you say about me may be true, but you misunderstand. Without my religion, I should scarcely be human." And I think in many ways that sums up where I'm at a lot of the time. And if you don't believe me, just ask my wife. All this by way of saying that take what follows for what it's worth. But in your quest for a renewed sense of purpose, I wonder if religious life could profitably employ an image that Benedict XVI has used to describe the situation of Christianity in the postmodern secular West, which is that of a creative minority. He draws the concept from Arnold Toynbee, who wrote that the revitalization of a society always depends upon its creative minorities, that is, subgroups who exercise a disproportionate influence by virtue of their passion and their imagination. As applied to Christianity, the Holy Father's insight is that the Church today can no longer depend upon the instruments of the state or the overwhelming consensus of a popular majority. Instead, he believes Christianity's short-term future rests with what he's termed islands of spiritual composure, that is, groups of committed Christians who come together to live the faith with joy and integrity, and whose witness is therefore vital for the broader culture. Even if the vast majority of postmodern men and women are not willing to commit themselves to all that such a life entails, Benedict believes, they may nevertheless be drawn to it, recognizing that this is the direction in which the future lies. And in the same way, I wonder if religious communities today might think of themselves as a creative minority within Catholicism. In other words, what Christianity is to the secular society, religious life can be to the Church, a series of islands of spiritual composure, however depleted in membership, which nevertheless play a critical and disproportionate role in equipping the Church to respond to this cultural moment. Now, serving as a creative minority in this sense requires a grasp of the challenges facing Catholicism today. And I'd like to draw your attention to three megatrends in the contemporary life of the Church, which come into focus at three different levels of magnification. Now, I put these trends on the table not to condemn them and certainly not to applaud them, and certainly not because they recognize or because they embody my personal vision of an ideal church. Whatever our personal opinions about these megatrends may be, they are, nevertheless, the seismic shifts, so to speak, that are today realigning the tectonic plates of global Catholicism. And for that reason, they play a critically important role in shaping the context in which your reflections need to occur. So the first bit of context, and here we're going to use the global lens, looking at the global level of Roman Catholicism. And I would suggest the most important bit of context there is the shift from north to south. The shift from north to south. I begin with two different snapshots of the global church at different moments in time. In 1900, at the dawn of the 20th century, there were 459 million Catholics in the world, of whom 392 million were in Europe and North America, and just 67 million scattered across the entire rest of the planet, principally in Latin America. Christianity 100 years ago remained an overwhelmingly first world and largely white phenomenon. In 2000, by way of contrast, there were 1.1 billion Catholics in the world, with just 380 million in Europe and North America, and the strong majority, almost 800 million, in the global south. Roughly half of the Catholics in the world today live in Latin America alone. Africa in the 20th century went from a Catholic population of 1.9 million in 1900 to 137 million in 2000, a staggering growth rate of 6,708%. Sit with that number for a moment, 6,708%. And given demographic and religious trends, this population realignment in global Christianity will continue. By 2025, only one Catholic in 5 in the world will be a non-Hispanic Caucasian, 1 in 5. This is the most rapid and most sweeping demographic transformation of Christianity in its 2,000-year history. And the new growth in Africa and Asia, to some extent in Latin America, is not merely replicating pre-existing European patterns. Instead, it is creating myriad new forms of Christianity as the faith mingles with indigenous customs and concepts. And by the way, this is not all good news for the Catholic Church. The fastest growing brand of Christianity in the Southern Hemisphere is formed by a bewildering variety of Pentecostal and evangelical groups, which are attracting significant numbers of Catholic converts. In 1930, Protestants amounted to less than 1% of the total population of Latin America. Today, it's between 12 and 15%, some 64 million people. A study commissioned in the late 1990s by CELAM, that's the Federation of Latin American Bishops' Conferences, found that 8,000 Latin Americans were leaving Catholicism for one of these Pentecostal or evangelical churches every day. Every day. This defection has given rise to the gallows humor in Latin America that after Vatican II, the Catholic Church chose the poor, and the poor chose the Pentecostals. The same tendencies, to some extent, can of course be found in Africa and Asia. And the future of Catholicism in the Southern Hemisphere will therefore be shaped to a large degree by the encounter with Pentecostalism and the new urban mega-churches, which means different interlocutors and a different set of questions than set the theological agenda in the North. Another point worth noting in all of this is that the 67 million Catholics in the United States represent just 6%, that's 6% of the global Catholic population of 1.1 billion. We are just the 4th largest Catholic country in the world, after Brazil with 144 million Catholics, Mexico with 126 million, and the Philippines with 70 million. What this means is that 94% of the Catholics in the world are not like us, and American priorities and sensitivities, therefore, cannot always set the global agenda. And I always tell people, if you ever wonder why the Pope is not thinking American thoughts when he gets out of bed in the morning, this is part of the reason. It's a much bigger and more complex global church. Increasingly, power and influence in global Christianity will shift with population. Sao Paulo, Jakarta, and Nairobi will be to the Catholic world what Louvain, Milan, and Paris were in the Counter-Reformation period, meaning the primary centers of intellectual and pastoral energy. Among other things, this will imply, for example, a more literal reading of Scripture, along with a more vibrant and charismatic style of worship. As the Catholicism of the future increasingly speaks with an African and Hispanic accent, it will also speak in tongues. The vitality of this brand of Catholicism will cheer some Western conservatives with its emphasis on traditional sexual morality. It will gladden the hearts of some liberals with its sharp critique of global economic structures and American militarism. Increasingly, this global church will be a challenge for all sorts of first world sensibilities. And this challenge, by the way, is something the leadership of the church will encourage. Just yesterday, in his homily at the cathedral in Munich, Benedict XVI spoke to German Catholics about his experience of meeting with bishops from other parts of the world on their odd limina visits. Every now and then, the Holy Father said, some African bishop will say to me, if I come to Germany and present social projects, suddenly every door opens. But if I come with a plan for evangelization, I meet with reservations. The Pope went on to say that people in Africa and Asia admire our scientific and technical prowess, but at the same time, they are frightened by a form of rationality which totally excludes God from our vision, as if this were the highest form of reason, and one to be imposed on their cultures too. They do not see the real threat to their identity in the Christian faith, but in a contempt for God and the cynicism that considers mockery of the sacred to be an exercise of freedom, and that holds up utility as the supreme moral criterion for the future of scientific research. Dear friends, this cynicism is not the kind of tolerance and cultural openness that the world's peoples are looking for and that all of us want. My own experience of traveling throughout the global South and interviewing bishops, theologians, and lay activists from Southern churches suggests that the Holy Father's diagnosis indeed has some merit, and it promises interesting times ahead. All right, let's shift levels of magnification. The second bit of context I want to talk about is the Roman context, how things look from Rome. And here I'm going to talk about a concern for Catholic identity. Concern for Catholic identity. In his famous homily at the Mass Pro Elegendo Papa, celebrated the morning of the conclave that just 24 hours later would elect him Pope, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, acting as the Dean of the College of Cardinals, laid out what he saw as the central challenge facing the Church in our time. He memorably defined that challenge as a dictatorship of relativism, meaning the widespread modern tendency to reject not merely this or that truth claim, but the very idea that there is such a thing as objective truth. In some circles, he noted, relativism and its related virtue of tolerance have come to seem like prerequisites for life in a pluralistic world. Benedict, however, argued that relativism is profoundly dangerous, and to take only the most dramatic example, in a world not convinced that every human being possesses objective and inherent dignity, it is the weakest and most vulnerable among us who are immediately placed at risk. Like John Paul II before him, therefore, Benedict is keenly concerned that Catholics do not assimilate to this broader secular mentality, that we do not, in biblical language, become like salt that has lost its flavor. And as the practical translation of this imperative, the Church has seen a growing emphasis over the last 25 years on what sociologists call the politics of identity. That is, efforts to preserve our own distinctive Roman Catholic language, practices, belief systems, are markers of difference in a rapidly homogenizing world. Pressures for religious to wear habits, for example, or to return to traditional forms of prayer and devotion stem from this source. And shaped by these concerns, many bishops and other leaders coming on the scene today believe that the optimistic openness of the immediate post-Vatican II years too often degenerated into what Jacques Maritain once called kneeling before the world. Now, certainly this concern can be exaggerated, but I think few would deny the danger. Some years ago, I was invited to address a group of missionary congregations who had gathered in San Antonio to take up the fascinating theme of evangelizing secularity. As a matter of fact, I was invited to do so by Ron Rolheiser, who I know was with you, and having spent some time with Ron, you know it's hard to say no, and so there I was. And as I was speaking to these missionary congregations, I said one thing that struck me about the conversation we had had is that we've been discussing secularity as if it's a reality out there somewhere, when in truth, we ourselves are the sons and daughters of secularity. We are often unaware of the profound ways in which it has shaped our psychology, even in areas of life we normally mark off as religious. And as proof of the point, I noted that we tend to reproduce within the Church the same polemical attitudes, the same interest group tactics one finds in secular politics. And therefore, I would submit that far from evangelizing secularity, too often we have been evangelized by secularity. And indeed, I sometimes wonder if the world turns a deaf ear to the Church sometimes because we look, sound, and act so much like it, when in reality, people expect something better from us. Now, it should be said that John Paul and Benedict did not invent this thrust towards a more clear Catholic identity. It forms part of the Catholic culture of our time. And I'm sure you can probably recognize it from your own experience, especially among younger Catholics who often seek a clear sense of what makes them different. including a laudable, if at times overheated, desire to think with the church as a way of marking themselves off from secular society. Now, while recovering our traditional spiritual and intellectual vocabulary offers a fertile common ground for internal Catholic conversation, it also poses very real dangers, and we must be alert to them in terms of addressing ourselves to the outside world, because our points of reference may become increasingly alien to the broader secular culture. And I think the 2001 Vatican document Dominus Jesus offers a classic case in point. In asserting that, objectively speaking, non-Christians are in what that document called a gravely deficient situation, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith understood itself merely to be reaffirming a core article of the Christian Creed, that is, that Jesus Christ is the lone Savior of the world. And obviously, the fact that then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger had no intention of launching a holy war can be inferred from the deeply respectful way he has engaged other faiths as Pope Benedict XVI. Yet, because the document did not speak in the tolerant argot of postmodernity, it, of course, as we all well know, set off international shockwaves. And I think that episode illustrates the challenges of translation that this new emphasis on speaking our own language from within a traditional Roman Catholic worldview are going to create. All right, third bit of context to the American context. And here I want to talk about the problem of Catholic tribalism. The Catholic Church in the United States is, of course, rich in virtually every sense of the word. We have vibrant parishes, world-class universities, top-flight Catholic hospitals, and the most theologically literate Catholic laity in the world. Pope John Paul II once said that he believed the reason that the new movements had not really taken hold in the United States is because this is the only country in the world where the vision for parish revitalization of the Second Vatican Council had actually occurred. Reflecting the pluralistic character of American culture, we count Catholics of all shapes and sizes, of all ethnicities and languages, all socioeconomic and cultural subgroups, all ideological and theological convictions. And in principle, this is a tremendous, indeed I would even say, a globally unparalleled blessing. Sadly, however, we don't always experience it that way. On the contrary, this diversity, I would suggest, is more often the cause of rancor, pitting left against right, liturgically oriented Catholics against social justice activists, and so on down the familiar litany of internal fractures. For anyone with a sense of history, the situation facing American Catholicism today cannot, in a sense, help but seem terribly ironic. American Catholics spent the first half of the 20th century clawing their way out of a ghetto that had been imposed upon them by a hostile Protestant majority. And we have spent the second half of the 20th century reconstructing ghettos of our own ideological choice, so that we have finished the century more divided than before, but this time we're not divided against the Protestants, we're divided against ourselves. If we're honest, I would submit that the bitter debates within Catholic circles during the Bush-Kerry election in 2004 suggest to us that this problem is getting worse rather than better. It's instructive to note that no other Catholic culture on earth has gone through a similar upheaval about denying Catholic politicians the sacraments on the basis of their voting records. And without assessing the rights or wrongs of any position, I suspect that the terms of the debate itself speaks an important truth to us about the punitive nature of Catholic division in this country. American Catholics today, by and large, move in self-contained circles. We have social justice Catholics, charismatic Catholics, neoconservative Catholics, Vatican II Catholics, traditional Catholics, to name only a few of the most familiar tribes. Now, this reality is usually characterized by the term polarization, but that's actually misleading if it's taken to suggest that the only fault line of consequence runs between right and left. Tribalism, I think, is a better term for the sociological reality. In a sense, there is no such thing as a Catholic Church in the United States. What we have are multiple Catholicisms, and quite often they're not on speaking terms. Today's problem is not so much that we have divisions. That's a reality of Christian life that goes back to the Act of the Apostles. The problem is that we lack common language even to discuss our divisions. On the rare occasion when today's American Catholic encounters someone from another point of view, it's not merely that they disagree on issues, but they have widely differing senses of what the issues actually are. They have gone so far down separate paths as to lack common points of reference, and that fact would render dialogue problematic even if both parties were actually interested in talking to each other. In practice, however, the parties are rarely all that interested. The result is that moving across the party lines in American Catholicism can be a depressing experience. Now, granted, this is an overgeneralization, but I nevertheless believe that it captures something real which all of us can recognize. So, what does it mean? What might it mean for religious life to be a creative minority in terms of the three bits of context I've just suggested? As you have no doubt already surmised, each of the megatrends I have just described carries with it the risk and in many cases the reality of very painful division. Each pivots on a fracture, north versus south, Catholic identity versus secular modernity, and for lack of a better taxonomy, left versus right. Facing this peril of ever-increasing balkanization, what would it mean for women's and men's religious communities to be a creative minority? How might diminishing numbers of religious nevertheless fashion a life that would be recognized by the men and women of our time as pointing the way towards a less vociferous future, one based on dialogue rather than diatribe? Again, with no credentials really to make this suggestion to you, I nevertheless dare to propose that one way of doing so is by conceiving of yourselves as women and men with a special apostolate for community, taking as your motto Christ's final wish for the church expressed in the high priestly prayer of John 17, ut unum sint, that they may be one. The church has always been Catholic in principle, as a theological affirmation in the creed, but we are today becoming sociologically Catholic for the first time in our history, which cannot help but further destabilize our already fragile internal ecology. As this global church takes shape, liberal reformers in the West will find that many Southern Catholics simply are not interested in their projects, especially on issues of human sexuality, such as gay marriage. Neoconservatives will be alarmed at the increasingly sharp critique of American foreign policy that bubbles up in the leadership ranks in the church. Average parishioners, in many cases, may fear or resent the new pastor with a thick African or Indian accent and a different way of doing business. Western Catholics may come to resent the way that Europe and North America increasingly seem like the ecclesiastical periphery rather than the center. And other strains abound. As Rome presses for ever greater clarity on Catholic identity, some Catholics will chafe at what they see as false litmus tests or selective versions of Catholicity. Women and men outside the church may have a hard time understanding Catholic discourse as it recovers vocabulary and concepts from an earlier age that simply don't reflect the language of MTV or the stock market. American Catholics caught in the crossfire of ideological trench warfare in the church may despair of finding spiritual comfort. Now, I've been using the modal verb may in describing these dangers, but in truth, we all know they are already recognizable features of our common experience. A towering imperative of our time is therefore to ensure that these tensions remain creative rather than destructive. And on this front, you in religious life possess unique resources. You have a deep, millennial-old experience of forging communities that do not deny differences, but which relativize them, so to speak, with respect to building a common life. This is what consecrated women and men have done throughout the centuries. You are artisans of community. Father Timothy Radcliffe has referred to the Dominican culture of conversation, and in different forms, all of you have similar legacies. Your spiritual patrimony allows you to foster that primordial Catholic instinct that being family is more important than being right, and that having a place at the common table of faith is more valuable than rushing to the barricades to defend our own private agenda. Your communities already straddle the divides we have just outlined. Within religious communities, one finds women and men from the developed North and the growing South. We find members thoroughly immersed in the hustle and bustle of modern life, as well as those more attuned to the ancient language and rhythms of the church. We find members who are more liberal in their more liberal in their theological and political instincts, living cheek by jowl alongside those who are more conservative. Your tendency, I suspect, is often to take this almost for granted because it has always been thus. What I am proposing is that the polychrome communities in which you live are not merely a precondition for apostolate, they are your apostolate in this era, in the sense that your mode of life and the values which underlie it are like balm for an ever more broken church. Your call is to become steadily more intentional about promoting the value of community in the broader Catholic discussion. Your orders, for example, might sponsor retreats around the idea of bridging the North-South divide. You might volunteer as spiritual mentors for parishes where ideological divisions have fractured a sense of common purpose. You might launch lecture series or publications on the common life. You might simply become more conscious about sharing your experience of community with the rest of us. Whatever form it takes, the Church desperately needs your wisdom. For 2,000 years, your commitment to community has been a precious gift, but today I would submit it looms as a sine qua non, not merely for our vitality, but for our capacity to function at all. Our future consists either of steadily growing heartache and division, or the strength and passion that flows from a genuine experience of spiritual family. To be honest, I do not believe that the hierarchy, Catholic intellectuals, the Catholic press, the parish system, or any other piece of our ecclesiastical infrastructure is equipped to help us in quite the same way that religious women and men can. Dostoevsky once said that only beauty will save the world. I would contend that in this new era, only community will save the Church, and you are our apostles of community. This is the moment of opportunity, I would propose, awaiting you as a creative minority within the Catholic fold. For the foreseeable future, perhaps relatively few of us will step forward to become Franciscans or Viatorians or School Sisters of Notre Dame. We pray this is not so, but it is certainly a plausible scenario. However few you may be, you will be light and life to the Church if you hold up to us authentic models of community, built not on ideological self-selection, but on real Catholicity, where robust debate and common purpose are not at odds, and where clarity of identity and openness to the other are two sides of the same coin. In the end, I would submit to you that vocations will come from your passion for community. Communities will not come from a mania for vocations. Now, if I can beg your indulgence for 2 more moments, I would like to end with a story that is set in the region of the world where I grew up, which is the high plains of rural western Kansas. Now, if any of you have ever been there, and I can think of no earthly reason why you should have been, but if you ever have, you will know that western Kansas is not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry. In fact, about the only time of year we attract significant numbers of out-of-town visitors is during the fall when it's pheasant hunting season. And usually these visitors are groups of out-of-town businessmen who find the idea of putting on, combat fatigues and blasting shotguns while drinking copious amounts of beer a real hoot. To be honest, they're usually a far greater danger to one another than they are to the pheasants. But in any event, they seem to find this fun. The small western Kansas town where my grandparents live, it's called Hill City. It's a town of 500 people, and believe me, this is a misnomer if ever there was one. There's no hill there, and it's certainly not a city. But it has one motel, 12-room motel, and it's the only motel in my life I have ever stayed that has a laminated sign above the sink in the bathroom saying, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." Honest to God. This story is set on one weekend during pheasant hunting season. We have a lawyer from New York who has made the trek out to western Kansas to try to satisfy this primal instinct to shoot something out of the sky. And so he spends a long and frustrating weekend, firing off one blast after another with no success. And so finally, mid-morning Sunday rolls around, and he has about an hour left before he has to get in his rental car and drive the 400 miles back to Kansas City to catch a plane back to New York. He decides he's going to literally take one more shot at this. And so he sees a pheasant moving across the skyline, and he shoulders his weapon, trains his eye, fires, and miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. So, flush with a sense of triumph, he sets off across the field to pick up his trophy. And just as he gets to the spot where the pheasant has landed, he comes across a barbed wire fence that is clearly labeled, "Stay out, private property." But the lawyer figures, I have invested too much blood, toil, tears, and sweat at this stage to let this go, so I'm going to go over this fence and get my bird. So he begins to climb over the fence, and just at that moment, the western Kansas farmer pulls up in his tractor and says to him, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And the lawyer says, "Well, I'm climbing over the fence to pick up the pheasant." And the farmer says, "No, you're not. That bird landed on my property. It belongs to me." Well, you got to understand the kind of exhaustion and frustration with which this lawyer has been living. So he just erupts and he says, look, you don't understand. I'm a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York. If you don't let me have that bird, I'm going to sue you back to the Stone Age. Not realizing, of course, that's pretty much where the farmer is already living. I grew up there, so I can say these things. And the farmer looks at him and smiles, and he says, well, you know, that may be how you settle problems where you come from, but around here we have a little something called the three-kick rule. Lawyer says, three-kick rule, what's that? Farmer says, well, it's pretty simple. It works like this. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going until somebody gives up. Whoever wins gets the bird. The lawyer thought for a moment. He said, well, that's probably less expensive than a lawsuit. And plus, this guy looks like he's 120 years old. I can probably take him. So it's fine. So the 2 men line up against one another. The farmer looks at the lawyer and says, are you ready? And the farmer says, yeah. And so the farmer, you have to understand, is wearing these heavy Western Kansas work boots, right? Takes 1 shot in the lawyer's shins. The guy falls to his knee. He then takes another shot in his belly. You know, his howls of pain can be heard in a tri-county area. And then finally he takes a shot under his shin. The lawyer falls back in the dust. He's seeing stars. He's barely conscious. Finally, he summons the strength of will to stagger to his feet, dust himself off. And he looks at the farmer with a visage of grim determination. And he says, all right, you old coot, now it's my turn. The farmer looks at him and smiles and says, that's all right, you can have the bird. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that our conversations in the Catholic Church too often resemble an ecclesiastical version of the three-kick rule. That is, an attempt to take cheap shots and destroy our ideological enemies rather than a patient search for understanding and the building of a common life. Leading us out of this blind alley in this incredibly complex era in which we are now entering is a task for serious and imaginative people. It is a task for you. And I very much look forward to watching you rise to that occasion, as I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that you will. Thank you.
I know that we have a shuttle that is leaving for the airport, but John has graciously agreed to accept questions and answers from the audience. So we do have 3 microphones that are standing in the center and on either side of the room. So if anybody has any questions for further clarification or further elaboration.
I guess this is the point of the morning program. It would probably be helpful to put this on. Listen, let me add that I always tell people, you are welcome to ask questions about the presentation, obviously, but I always tell my audiences, you can also ask me anything you want about the Vatican, the papacy, the global church. Think of this as everything you ever wanted to know about the Holy See but were afraid to ask. Yes, ma'am.
As you outline or make us aware of how the church is burgeoning in the South, and especially in Africa, could you comment on the Vatican's attitude toward enculturation within these peoples? They're allowing them to use their own forms of worship. That seems to be a problem in some areas.
Yeah. Well, the first thing, and this is going to be a somewhat long-winded answer, and I apologize in advance, but the first point I always make when somebody asks me about what does the Vatican think about something is the observation that it's really a myth to believe there's such a thing as the Vatican out there in the sense of a kind of, single organism with a unified will and intellect. I mean, the reality is the Vatican is a complex bureaucracy in which there are lots of people who see things a lot of different ways. I'll tell you a very quick story apropos of papal travel. You may know when the Pope travels, he does so as both a head of state, that is, the Vatican is a sovereign entity that exchanges ambassadors with 174 countries and international organizations. He's also, of course, the head of the Catholic Church. So when he arrives in a foreign country, he's welcomed twice. Once in a formal diplomatic setting, and second in a very informal way by the head of the local Catholic Church, which is usually the president of the Bishops' Conference or the country's primate or something like that. But if it's a very small country, a very small Catholic country, that is. He's often welcomed by the nuncio, the papal ambassador there. And this story is set during the Holy Father's 2003 visit to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, you may know, is a country that has all of 114 Catholics. I actually ran the math. It would have been 4 times less expensive to fly all of them to Rome than to take the Pope to them. So in any event, this welcome was being done by the papal nuncio, and this is a very kindly Italian Monsignore, but a guy who has a reputation as a terrible windbag. And this particular day, he was in rare form. I actually clocked this welcome, ladies and gentlemen, at 40 minutes. And bear in mind, it was a 24-hour trip. I mean, we thought the Holy Father would be back in Rome before this guy was done welcoming him. And as this oration was rolling on, I was in the press pool for this, so I was at the end of one row of seats, and right across from me was the Vatican entourage. These are the senior cardinals and others who travel with the Pope. So I was seated more or less immediately next to a very senior Vatican cardinal, and I could tell as this oration was winding on that the cardinal was becoming increasingly frustrated. And you can tell these things, huh? Because his breathing was becoming more labored, his eyes were rolling in the back of his head, and so on. And so at one stage I leaned over and I said, "Cardinal, what do you think?" Well, there was this kind of nanosecond of hesitation. You could tell he was calculating, should I say this, should I not say it? But it was obvious he needed to get this off his chest. So he leaned into me, and in kind of sotto voce fashion, looking up at this Italian Monsignore going on and not really saying anything, the Cardinal whispered to me, "You realize that some Italian village is missing its idiot." True story. Now, I mention the story because in addition to being in a once-in-a-career punchline, I think what it does is puncture this myth that the Vatican is a kind of Stepford Wives environment in which everyone looks alike and dresses alike and thinks alike. And the truth is this is a fairly diverse group of folks. So to come back to the question about enculturation, I think there are some in the Holy See who, driven by these identity concerns, would be concerned with the limits of enculturation, that is, asserting that there needs to be a certain uniformity and a certain, what they would say in Italian, romanità, that is a kind of uniformity based on the Roman model of worship and devotion and self-expression and so on. Others, I think, would be more enthusiastic about sort of pushing the envelope a bit. But I think there is general agreement in the Holy See that the future of Catholicism in the Southern Hemisphere is to some extent going to be driven by this question of enculturation, although I should note that the Holy Father prefers the term interculturation to enculturation because his argument is that it's a myth to think that Christianity exists as a kind of pure faith that has no culture of its own. In fact, Christianity has grown up over 2,000 years, and there's a certain history there, a certain culture to it. So when Christianity interacts with another of the world's cultures, it's actually an exchange between two cultures, ideally purifying the best elements in both. But I do think there is a general consensus in the Holy See, particularly on this question, particularly around the idea that there will be a kind of spiritual cortisone injection, so to speak, from contact with the Southern churches, that somehow our modes of self-expression or liturgical self-expression can become more spontaneous, they can become more lively, they can become less formulaic through the experience of contact with the churches in the South. And as I say, this is going to be, a positive thing for some and a very uncomfortable thing for others. Many times I've had the experience of taking colleagues in Rome who were, this was in years past, for example, to the healings and deliverance services conducted by Archbishop Emmanuel Malingo, and watching my rather staid, buttoned-down Anglo-Saxon colleagues wonder, what the hell is going on here? I think increasingly that exchange is going to be a feature of our common experience, and it's going to be one that I think holds great promise, but it is also, again, going to need experts in kind of helping us navigate the potential fractures and the potential misunderstandings that exchange is going to create. Yeah.
I was in Rome this past May. It was at Pentecost, and at that weekend they had this major celebration of the lay ecclesial movements. There were several thousand people in Rome at that time. I would appreciate your comments on the rise of the lay ecclesial movements within the church. I asked that question because I have also read that there are people in the hierarchy within the church that are saying this is the future. It is a lay church, and sometimes some are perceiving that the Vatican, I know the complexities of the Vatican, but the Vatican has given up on the religious, and they are now seeing the future and the hope in the lay ecclesial movements. I know that the Union of Superiors General had requested an audience with Pope John Paul II for several years. It was scheduled and canceled at the last minute. Pope Benedict had met with the superior generals in Rome. It was a half-hour talk. It was in Italian, and there was no translation for non-Italian speakers.
Yeah, well, welcome to the Vatican.
Yes. But I would just appreciate your reflections on the rise of the lay ecclesial movements and maybe what is the disposition of the thinking in Rome of religious.
Well, a couple of points. First, I know it is common in North American Catholic conversation, when we say movements, we tend to think conservative movements, because the ones with which we're familiar sort of have that profile. I would say, seen from Rome, it is a much more, pluriform kind of environment. Actually, probably the most prominent lay ecclesial movement in Rome is the community of Sant'Egidio, whose profile would be more, if we have to think in political terms, would be more kind of center-left. So the first point I would make is that when there's a perception that Rome is promoting the movements, I think often we tend to think it means they're promoting a conservative agenda for the future of the church. I don't think that's how it's psychologically understood or experienced. The second point I would make is that certainly the more sophisticated thinkers in the Vatican would not perceive the growth of the movements as a kind of surrender on the future of religious life. I mean, I think the best thinkers would say this is not either or, it's both and. You are undeniably right that during the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, there was a widespread sense in religious life that the movements tended to get the strokes, they tended to get his time, his attention, his affirmation, his support, and that there was a corresponding sort of diminishment of support for the traditional forms of religious life. I think there has been some effort to remedy that under Benedict XVI. And obviously his meeting with the religious superiors in May, on the 22nd of May, was one piece of evidence of that. It remains to be seen how systematic that's going to be. But you asked about the growth of the movements. I mean, as a historical point, of course, these movements largely come from the early part of the 20th century. There was a great ferment in the church at that time, the late 19th, early 20th century, about the loss of the working class and the loss of the youth. There was a perception that Marxism and socialism and so forth had kind of won the hearts of the workers, won the hearts of the secular world. And there was a desire to create new lay-based apostolates that could somehow penetrate those environments and reclaim them for the church. Historically, that's where it comes from. I think sociologically, the growth of the movements in the post-conciliar period in Europe, however, has a lot more to do with the fact that, quite frankly, and this is an awful thing to say, and there are exceptions, but there is a real ecclesiastical winter in Europe today, in which, in many cases, parishes have become little more than sacramental filling stations. That is, they're places you pull in to go to Mass, and then you pull out. But there's a little more on offer. That is, there isn't anything recognizable as youth ministry. There isn't anything recognizable as a ministry to new spouses. There aren't soup kitchens, and then, I mean, all kind of beehive of activities that we think of from American pastoral experience. And in terms, therefore, of being able to create life and to provide people with a kind of vibrant sense of Christian mission that goes beyond the mere liturgical dimensions of church life, the movements, to some extent, have filled a vacuum that I think the kind of ordinary pastoral structures of the church had created. Back, of course, to what I said earlier about John Paul diagnosing why the movements have not had the same growth here they have had in Europe. His observation was that parishes tend to be much healthier here. And so I think that is the role that they are playing. But again, I think it would be personally, I think, let a thousand flowers bloom. I think the growth of the movements is one of the great acts of the Spirit in the recent life of the church. On the other hand, I think we would be kidding ourselves to think that the movements are an antidote to the revitalization either of religious life or of our existing pastoral structures. And I'll give you one piece of evidence of that. For the great Jubilee year of 2000, Cardinal Camillo Ruini, who was the Pope's vicar for the Diocese of Rome and the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, commissioned a very expensive, years-long sociological study of youth in the Diocese of Rome. That's the Pope's own backyard. And this study found that, and they defined youth, I think, as 14 to 24. So what the study found is that for the 10% of youth who were active in a movement, broadly defined, not necessarily just the focal laurea, but that could be Scouts, it could be Catholic Action, whatever. For the 10% of youth who were active in a movement, they were well catechized, they had positive attitudes towards the church, and they practiced their faith. For the 90% of youth who did not belong to a movement, they were terribly poorly catechized, had very negative attitudes towards the institutional church, and did not practice their faith. And this is, by the way, this is after 25 years of a steady promotion of the movements, above all in Rome. Okay? I think the conclusion there is that, the raw reality of the matter is that most Catholics, most of the time, are not going to make the kind of serious commitment of their time and energy that it takes to join a movement. They're simply not going to do it. And therefore, if we are going to reach most of our people, we cannot do it through the structure of the movements. I mean, I would think of the movements, to some extent, as I was arguing, we can think of religious life as a kind of creative minority. That is a kind of beacon of a particular option within the church that generates energy. But it's never going to be the routine vehicle of delivering pastoral care, and nor do I think that anyone in the Holy See is under the illusion that they will be. Yes?
This is more of a general question, but both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict have been emphasizing Catholic identity, but it strikes me that they are doing, or that Benedict is doing it in a different way, a different style than John Paul II did. It seems more nuanced, a little bit maybe more diplomatic. I'm not sure what word, a little less embattled. And I just wanted to, I'd be curious of your observations about that. There was a lot of concerns when Benedict was first elected. What would this papacy be like? And I think that, at least I, for one, have kind of liked what I've seen, that it's been a more conciliatory kind of thing. And also in terms of the kinds of bishops that Benedict will appoint versus what John Paul II did. I think John Paul II tended to maybe appoint more enforcers, and I don't know if there's any kind of trend in terms of what kind of bishops Benedict might appoint. So just interested in your observations
Sure.
along those lines.
Well, apropos of those expectations you refer to, and in some quarters alarm about the election of Benedict XVI, you all know what his reputation was prior to becoming Pope. This was God's Rottweiler, enforcer of the faith, and all of that. And that, in some quarters, set off alarm, obviously, on April 19th when he was elected. I think the best expression of those expectations that I saw was in an editorial cartoon in the Italian newspaper L'Unità. Now, L'Unità, for those of you who know Italy, know this is the newspaper of the old Communist Party, so it has a real left-wing slant. To understand this cartoon, you need just one bit of background, which is that in Italy, still today probably, the best-loved pope of modern times is John the 23rd. Il Papa Buono, good Pope John. And the Italians have all kinds of images and memories of John the 23rd rumbling around in their collective unconscious, but probably the most famous was an evening in October 1962. This was the opening of the Second Vatican Council. And Catholic Action, which is this huge movement in Italy, had planned a torchlit parade that was going down the Via della Conciliazione, and it finished in St. Peter's Square, okay? Just literally 1,000 points of light in the square. And the Pope was not supposed to address the crowd. It wasn't in the program. But John the 23rd, hearing the commotion and so forth, decided he wanted to say something. And so they flung open the windows of the papal apartment, and he came, and a microphone was brought. And he launched into this stream of consciousness, discorso about the beauty of the moon and all this other stuff. But he ended with a line that is sort of burned into the Italian national consciousness. Okay, this is for many Italians what, 7 years ago, or, ask not what your country can do for you is for us. Okay, it's just part of the collective memory. I actually, a few weeks ago, right before I left Rome, I actually saw this line used to sell mattresses, believe it or not. So, looking at the crowd, John, sort of looking, again, beautiful moonlit evening and so forth, looking down at this crowd, he said something. I'll give it to you first in Italian and then I'll translate. He said, "Stasera, quando andate via casa, troverete I vostri bambini. Dateli una carezza e diteli che questa carezza viene dal Papa." Which means, tonight when you go home, you'll find your kids. Give your children a kiss and tell them that this kiss comes from the Pope. Okay? Classic expression of the pastoral heart of the man. Okay, so cut back to that L'Unità cartoon. Has Benedict XVI standing in the same window, once again looking down on the crowd in the square, saying, "Tonight, when you go home, you'll find your children. I want you to give them a spanking and tell them that this spanking comes from the Pope. Okay. Classic expression of the kinds of fears and apprehensions that some had about what this papacy was going to produce. And of course, I suppose it goes without saying that that is hardly the logic that led the 115 cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel to elect Joseph Ratzinger as Pope, nor, I would submit, is it what we have seen in these first 18 months. In fact, I think the dominant storyline of these first 18 months has been the relentlessly, so to speak, positive, moderate, and gradualist approach that Benedict has adopted. He's not, and John Paul II, of course, was this larger-than-life personality. He was like a Polish king sweeping down the Tatra Mountains, Benedict he's a shy German professor. That's his personality. And so I think you're right, there has been a more nuanced, and I think in some ways a remarkably thoughtful engagement. And I think it's one very much focused on the pastoral basics. I've now covered 4 trips with Benedict XVI, and I'll tell you folks, when Benedict XVI travels, he has an intended audience in mind, and it is certainly not the press, because he simply does not deliver the kind of ideological red meat that would make headlines for us. Okay? He very much talks about the spiritual basics. Look at what he's talking about in Bavaria. He's meeting with catechists yesterday. He's talking about the inner beauty of the Eucharist and the need to discover contemplation in our everyday lives and the importance of a rhythm of prayer and so on. And so I think there is a pastoral tone, and I think that has, to some extent, been the watchword in terms of his appointments to key leadership positions as well. He has simply not appointed the ideologues of any stripe that I think some had expected. Now, having said all that, I would say let us not be under any illusions that there has been and will continue to be a strong emphasis on Catholic identity under this pontificate. 2 days ago, in his meeting with the bishops of Ontario, their ad limina visit, Benedict warned quite bluntly that he sees in some quarters of the Canadian Church a kind of unacceptable assimilation to secularity, and he called them to vigilance about that. So this is not going to go away, but I think at the core of it, what we have in Benedict is someone who is convinced that emphasis on Catholic identity has to, in the first place, be phrased in positive terms. And I think this is a product of his German experience, a man who lived through 1968 and its aftermath. He knows there are a lot of people out there who think that institutional Christianity is largely a catalog of prohibitions and condemnations. And I think his desire is to represent the Christian message in the first place as a positive one. That ultimately this is about a love affair with Christ and the community he called into being, which is the church, or it's about nothing. And I'll finish with this. Right before he went to Bavaria, he did an interview with German television. And one of the broadcasters asked him, said, "Holy Father, when you went to Spain, you were in the country that's being led by Prime Minister Zapatero and the Spanish socialists. They've liberalized abortion and divorce and stem cell research and gay marriage. And yet, you didn't go on the assault. What was that about?" And the Pope said, "Well, it is my conviction." He said, "First of all, they only gave me 25 minutes to speak, and there's only so much you can say." But he said, for too long we have presented this image that Christianity is about a no. It's about saying no to things. We need to recover is the deeper Christian sense that behind every no is a yes. It's a yes to authentic flourishing, authentic human happiness. And I mentioned this story because I happened to be sitting with, I recently had lunch with a very senior Vatican official who had been in the room when Cardinal Alfonso Lopez Trujillo, who is the head of the Pontifical Council for the Family, and a noted kind of cultural warrior who would definitely embrace a kind of more sterner and more pugnacious approach. When Lopez Trujillo was handed the text of the Pope's interview, and my friend who was at the table with Lopez Trujillo watched him read the text as the color steadily drained from his face, and then he cut the meeting short and stormed out of the room. So my point is that the approach we have seen from the Holy Father has been something of a revelation, and I think it does in some circles sit uneasily, and that I think will be part of the drama of the future of this pontificate to watch how all of that plays out. Yes, ma'am.
On your book in Opus Dei, you list quite a list of Opus Dei bishops, especially in South America. How do you see this shaping the church?
Well, first of all, there are a number of Opus Dei bishops in Latin America. That number is, I think, 31. But bear in mind, that's out of 40 in a total of more than 4,500 Catholic bishops in the world. So I think, sometimes we have a kind of overheated imagination that this group or that group is taking over. I don't think that 40 out of 4,500 represents a stranglehold, nor would I say that Opus Dei bishops by themselves are in a position to determine the future direction of the Church in Latin America. And of course, Opus Dei is a bit like the Vatican itself. It's more internally diverse than its image might suggest to you. But on the whole, I would say that particularly in Latin America, Opus Dei bishops would represent an option for a more personal spirituality as opposed to putting the emphasis in the first place on social engagement. I think they would represent an option for a more traditional form of liturgical expression and devotion and so on. They would see that to some extent as a corrective to what they would see as an overemphasis in the other direction in the post-conciliar years. But I guess my point there would be that while that's their profile, and whatever you may think about that, I don't think that on their own strength or given their own resources, they're necessarily in a position to impose that on anyone else. I think what that represents is one among many options and forces in the Church, and particularly in Latin America. Again, I would tell you that I think the future of the Church in Latin America is not going to be driven really by our internal Catholic debates about, whether liberation theology was a good idea or a bad idea, or, Rome versus the local churches. Because increasingly there's a much bigger problem, and that much bigger problem is the failure of the Catholic community in Latin America to deliver the basic kind of pastoral assistance that people perceive they need, and their consequent choice to find that pastoral care somewhere else in ever-increasing numbers. I was with a Brazilian bishop recently, and I'd asked him this question about what is the state of liberation theology in Brazil, and he gave an answer to the question, but he said, these days I find myself thinking far more about why do people that want just basic meat and potatoes pastoral care, the husband is on booze, the kids are in gangs, our home is a mess. Why can't they find it from us? Why is it that they feel they need to seek that someplace else? Why is it that people who feel a need to become involved and engaged in the expression of their faith seem to feel they have to seek that in a Pentecostal or a charismatic community and can't find it with us? Why is it that people who are looking for a sense of community, a sense of welcome and belonging, why is it that they can't find that with us? I really think those are going to be the questions that increasingly drive the conversation in Latin America. And frankly, on that score, I don't see Opus Dei having a distinctive answer. I don't think there's an Opus Dei party line on that. I think they are simply going to be part of a much broader and obviously quite urgent conversation. Is that it? Now, please sit back down, because if you get nothing else out of this experience, I want you to at least have one decent Pope joke to take home with you this morning. So, there is a severe financial crisis at the Vatican, and the Pope and the cardinals are sitting around in the Apostolic Palace trying to figure out what to do. And the phone rings on the Pope's desk, and he picks it up, and it's Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame. And he says to the Holy Father, "Holy Father, I will offer you $500 million if you will change the words, the Lord's Prayer, from give us this day our daily bread to give us this day our daily fried chicken." And the Pope says, well, it's a tempting offer, but it's not in my power to do, and so on. So he rings off. Time goes by, the financial crisis becomes more pronounced. Phone rings again. Colonel Sanders saying, "Holy Father, $750 million to change the words from give us this day our daily bread to give us this day our daily fried chicken." Pope says, well, once again, it's a very generous offer, but I really don't think it's something I can contemplate. So more time goes on. This time the financial crisis is truly desperate. They are looking at putting a going out of business sign on the central facade of St. Peter's Basilica. Okay? Phone rings, Colonel Sanders, one last offer, $1 billion to change the words from give us this day our daily bread to give us this day our daily fried chicken. And the Pope says, well, let me get back to you. So he goes into his consistory with the cardinals, and he says to them, "Gentlemen, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is I have solved the Holy See's financial crisis. Kentucky Fried Chicken is going to be donating $1 billion to the Vatican. And the cardinals rejoice. It's, Holy Father, it's a miracle. This is the answer to all of our prayers. And just as they're getting ready to pop the corks in the champagne bottles, it occurs to one of them to ask, but Holy Father, what's the bad news? And the Pope looks at them and says, gentlemen, the bad news is we have lost the Wonder Bread contract. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us, John, you began your talk by thanking us, but on behalf of all of us, I think we owe you a great deal of gratitude. Sometimes in this irrational church of tribalism, you do bring a rational, balanced voice to us to remind us that we are universal Catholics. Your column in the NCR has been changed to now all things Catholic. And certainly we appreciate all the things Catholic that you bring to us. So thank you so much. It's also at this time that I do need to give some thank yous to the many people who have put this event of these past 4 days together. As you know, this has been over 2 years in planning, and we have had many fine people who have been working with us. I began this convocation by acknowledging the Region 11, and Region 11 really has been exceptional in the support, the